Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 110. Today's guest is Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is writer and podcaster Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Maggie Tokuda-Hall is the author of the Parents' Choice Gold Medal-winning picture book, Also an Octopus, illustrated by Benji Davies. Her debut young adult novel, The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, was published in May 2020 by Candlewick Press. She lives in San Francisco. So, I have been a fan of Maggie's podcast, Drunk Safari, for quite some time. As she puts it, it's essential animal facts as brought to you by dilettantes. That show is not currently in production anymore, but if you're looking for a show that's always hilarious and fun and which will also teach you fun facts about animals, it's got a pretty long archive, so do check it out. Anyway, listening to that show is what led me to follow Maggie on Twitter, which is in turn how I found out about The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea. And I'm just so pleased that I did because it is one of my favorite YA books to come out in recent years. I've been describing it as a queer pirate mermaid YA fantasy, which is entirely accurate, but also, of course, incomplete. The book follows two characters, a young imperial noblewoman named Evelyn Hasegawa, whose family has sent her off on a sea voyage to an arranged marriage on an island on the edge of the empire, and then a young gender-fluid pirate called both Flora and Florian, who is a crew member aboard the ship that takes Evelyn captive. The story is both an action-filled adventure with magic and mermaids and double agents and all that great genre fun, and it's also a surprisingly subversive story about colonialism and the cost of violence. All in all, I just really enjoyed it, and so I'm thrilled to get to talk to Maggie about it on today's show. As I'm sure you can imagine, I do give this book my recommendation, and there is a link in the show notes to where you can buy a copy. There's also a purchase link for her picture book, which I mentioned before, Also an Octopus. I also always encourage you to order either book or both from your local independent bookstore. If you need a bookstore recommendation, one of my favorites here in San Diego is Mysterious Galaxy, which you can order from online at mystgalaxy.com. That's MYST Galaxy.com. Also in the show notes, you can find links to Maggie's website and to Drunk Safari, so do check those out as well. One more thing before we start. Due to some technical difficulties we had while recording, there will be a noticeable change in the audio quality about 6 minutes in, after which point the audio will go from perfectly serviceable Skype quality audio to that nice podcast quality audio we all love. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Before I say anything else, I wanted to say, first I wanted to actually say that and I think you know this, is that I've been such a huge fan of Drunk Safari and have been devastated with it going away. It's been one of my favorite shows listening to, and I always find it so hilarious and so uplifting, and I just love it. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Maybe when I'm able to drink regularly again, we'll bring it back.
Drunk Safari is how I found your other work, and I'm so glad that I did because I really enjoyed The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea quite a bit, and I'm really happy to get the chance to talk to you about it. That led me also to your picture book, Also an Octopus, which both I and my 5-year-old really loved.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So sort of one of the first things that I wanted to talk about with this is, I just mentioned your picture book. So you have one picture book now, and this is your debut YA novel. And I believe I read in another interview that you did that you have 2 more picture books and another YA book and a graphic novel that you're working on.
It's two YA graphic novels. I don't have another YA novel just yet.
Well, so you have a lot of stuff that you're working on, and it's in a lot of different formats, a lot of different genres. And I remember, I read in that interview you talking about what you like about writing in different genres. But one of the things that I was sort of wondering about here is sort of what, for you, the appeal and or maybe challenges of writing to wildly different audiences is.
Yeah. That's a good question that I ask myself all the time because it was a very poor professional choice. So basically, if you're a writer of books, you build and I hate this word, but you build sort of your own brand so that when book buyers see your name, they kind of know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
And I have just made that impossible for myself and for anyone who might ever want to follow my career. So that's the downside of it, is that, you don't establish any kind of discernible brand, especially since there's not even like a tone in common across the different things that I've written. So, I guess I'm kind of hyper aware of that right now as I'm trying to promote a young adult book to people who know me from my drunk podcast or from a column I wrote about being pregnant for Catapult, or from my picture book. And I'm like, hey, now I have this high fantasy young adult novel. And they're like, I'm sorry, have we met? So, that's a difficulty. The good thing about it, though, is that I'm very rarely bored.
Yeah. I mean, I think, because I read that column that you did for Catapult, like in particular, the thing that you wrote about the macarons.
Thank you.
And I really was moved by that. As I mentioned, I loved this picture book, and I really loved The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea. To me, these things, even though on paper they're very different, they all do seem like they're coming from the same person. And I find that really interesting. But I guess, one of the things that I was thinking about too is like the audience for a book like Also an Octopus is obviously like a totally different age range, a totally different sort of level of comprehension, a totally different thing than writing a YA novel. It seems like how you would even think about approaching these different projects would have to be sort of wildly different. And I wouldn't even know where to start. That's sort of where I was interested in,
I bet you would know where to start because you're a writer. And I do make the argument all the time that writing across for different age groups should kind of start all from the same place, which is just sort of thinking about story. You have a character who wants something, what do they want? How do they fit into their world? Do they get the thing that they want? The kind of broken pyramid of narrative arc is the same for a picture book, is the same for a poem, is the same for a novel. So I bet you have a lot more grounding in it than you might think, especially as somebody who reads across all those different categories.
I guess. I mean, it's it does seem like a pretty different skill set, though.
Yes, it is. And I will say that writing a picture book's harder than writing a novel.
What do you? I would also think so, but like, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so what I mean is with a novel, you have all this time and you can kind of justify your choices. You can explore different ideas. Not every little thing has to pay off in a big way at the end of the book. Sometimes you have room to explore a lot more with a novel. I mean, you could go the Donna Tartt, Kazuo Ishiguro route where like every single word is immaculate and perfect, but not all of us are playing at that level. So, there's a lot of time. With a picture book, it's like writing a poem, except for you have to have an entire narrative arc in it. So that's an entire story in 500 to 1,500 words.
Yeah.
That has to do all the same work as a novel.
It strikes me that you're talking about this sort of structure of writing anything, like writing a picture book versus writing a novel, and how it all kind of comes from the same place. One of the things I found really interesting in comparing these two books is how, like, Also an Octopus is very explicitly about what a story is. The whole book is kind of explaining storytelling and story structure to children, which to me is what really, like, I mean, I just never seen anything like that before. I thought it was really cool. Storytelling is also really an important part of The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea in a number of ways. And so it seems like this preoccupation with storytelling as storytelling is pretty important to you and must be something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. So can we talk a little bit about that?
First of all, I'm like super excited that you asked that because that's my favorite thing to think about all the time and forever. And I tried to tell my agent that was my brand, and she was like, try again. I think about storytelling constantly because I come from a family of storytellers. I think on both sides of my family, there's a lot of writers, particularly on my dad's side of the family. Everyone there is somehow involved in the business of storytelling. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, that's my Jewish side of the family. And for Jews, telling stories over and over and over again and trying to interrogate them anew every year is like kind of the whole thing. And so I grew up with a real premium placed on your ability to tell a story, your ability to understand a story, your ability to interrogate a story. And so I feel like on the one hand, I'm very proud of the things that I've written. And on the other hand, I feel like there was no way I was going to not write them just by merit of of who I was raised by and the way that, every family brunch goes. And so, I love to think about the power that stories have, and to have, if you're going to do something meta, have it not just be meta for the sake of meta.
With this book, the way that story sort of functions in the story is really interesting to me, because on the one hand, the way that magic is presented in this, magic literally is stories. It literally is the power of stories to change the world, which just like sort of as like an allegory or a symbol is like really powerful for me. But also another big part of it is the sort of stories that each character tells themselves and tells other people about themselves is also a really big thing, and how that shapes how they understand themselves was also something that I found really interesting. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thank you. I think teens are particularly receptive to that kind of story because that's when they start writing their own story the most profoundly. I remember being, between 14 and 18 years old, and like every new school year was like another chance to kind of start my story over again and be like, well, this year I'm this. This year I'm super cool, and this year I'm like really chill, and like nothing you say bothers me. And then the next year it was like everything you say bothers me. And so I hope that teen readers see themselves in that, because they're still in the process of making their own stories, and to see that the thing that they're going through is profound and is also the same exercise that nations go through and that define history. Because I think we do have a tendency to kind of look at teenagers and what they're doing and be like, you're silly, you're stupid, you only feel so strongly because it's your first time. And discount the fact that actually what they're doing is the lifelong work that we all do every day until we're dead. And it's the same work that countries do to define themselves, and that movements do to define themselves, religions do to define themselves. It's not trivial work at all. It's deeply profound. And I hope they see that themselves in that when they read this book.
Yeah. I mean, bringing up this thing about how nations see themselves, I mean, that's also seems to be a pretty central thing in this book. And and this is something that you've talked a bit about in other interviews about this book, but it was something that really, for me, was a really interesting experience about this book, how the sort of imperial class, the sort of many of the main antagonistic forces here are coded as, well, the main thing that jumped out at me initially was how they're coded as sort of Japanese-esque. And as a person who is Japanese American, as I know you are as well, and also mixed race, that was a really interesting thing. And you've also talked about how it's not just that they're coded as Japanese, but there are also influences of American imperialism and British imperialism mixed in there as well.
Yeah.
So as a person who, like I just said, I am a mixed race person, like I have white grandparents and Japanese grandparents. I'm American but of Japanese heritage. This sort of mixing to me, on the one hand, it feels really like something I don't see a lot, but also having this be in the context of these are the antagonists in the story is something that, like, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, being Japanese American is this really sort of fraught experience, you know? So there was something about having the sort of villains in this story be set this way. It really touched on some things that were very much in line with things that I've personally been struggling with for quite a while now, in my own life. Is that something that we can talk about?
Totally. I'm so excited to talk about this with another half Japanese person, honestly. Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing about being Japanese American that makes the interrogation of our own heritage incredibly complicated is the fact that in the United States, we do not have sort of like a blessed experience. I come from grandparents who were interned. That's where they met. And that sort of generational trauma gets passed down of like being really afraid of authority, knowing that our acceptance in this country is extremely conditional. So as a kid, I had a real sense of Japanese Americans being a group that required protection. Like they would always be the good guy in a story that I would tell as a kid. And then as I got older, I started learning about Japan's history. And it was like, oh no. In fact, I also part of my heritage, not only as an American, but as a Japanese person, is this brutal imperialist tradition of just subjugating other people and not respecting their lives, and this real sense of superiority, which, you know, I think when we're frank about it, a bit of that came along with, you know, just because we left the country doesn't mean that we left all of those ideas behind. I was certainly raised with like, oh, if it's Japanese, then it's better. That kind of attitude. And so in this book, I really wanted to interrogate sort of the long tail of my own heritage, not just, you know, sort of the last two generations, but what it meant to be Japanese and American. And that means looking at American history and British history as well as these brutal colonialist powers.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I liked about this project, right, is that, you know, when I think about the way that American culture is so, obviously it's not all Americans. This is like sort of the central conflict of our time, right? Is like, what does it mean to be American? Where some people really want to focus on like American exceptionalism and like all of these like great things from our history. And other people are really trying to reckon with the atrocities in our history. The same thing is playing out in Japan. I mean, this whole thing in Japan about, you know, the government there still not acknowledging the atrocities that they committed against Korea or against China during World War II is like deeply, deeply upsetting to me.
Yeah.
You know, seeing a book like this that brings together all of these different sort of cultural influences, but does so in a way that is actually interrogating those things. I mean, I don't know if it's a rare thing, but it doesn't seem like it's happening enough. You know what I mean?
Thank you. I mean, I'm biased, but I agree. I do feel like a lot of the time people are sort of shopping for their marginalizations instead of auditing their privileges. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that shows in writing a lot. I don't know, maybe I'm a masochist, but I do feel like when you write a novel, you're doing the work of brutal self-awareness as well. Because everything that we write is in some way kind of a self-portrait, whether we like it or not. And I don't want to write one that's a love letter without questioning, you know, who I am and where I came from. And I think, you know, this is a first novel, and in some ways I think you can tell. And one of them is that it's really preoccupied with that question. Like, where did I come from?
There's a lot of stuff that's, I'm not really sure what the right way to put it is. Like, I don't want to call them like issues exactly, because I don't think that's quite right. But like, there are different aspects of identity that are explored or at least presented in this book. That is one of the things that I find so exciting about contemporary fiction, especially contemporary science fiction and fantasy, and especially contemporary YA science fiction and fantasy, is like there are so many books that are like queer as hell and like totally unapologetic about it. And I love that. And there are so many books that are looking at race in interesting ways. I liked the way that in this book that certain things about race are sort of, the world building around it is handled in ways that are very sort of subtle, but also striking. Like just the fact that white people in this book are not called white, they're called pink. Is
sorry, that is a joke just for me.
But, well, I mean, you know, one of the things that I thought was so interesting about that is that we have in our culture, such an association of just the word white has so many connotations of like purity or of like, you know, moral goodness, right?
Exactly.
And calling these people pink in this book sort of separates that a little bit. Yeah. And I thought that was like, it's such a small thing, but that it is doing so much work. And I felt like a lot of things in this book were kind of like that. So I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you were approaching that, how you were thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I laughed because it on the one hand, it is a joke to me because I think it's very funny. But it was a really purposeful choice in terms of craft because of what you said. White is this insanely overdetermined word with so much baggage that I really just don't agree with. And one of the main things that it comes with, particularly in fiction and in fantasy, is this idea of white neutrality. Like you just sort of assume characters are white until you are told otherwise. And so what that effectively does is other everyone who's not white. And my idea was that these Imperials are not white. They're like me. I pictured them all looking like me, basically, of like half Japanese, half white kind of a look, but they're not white. And so they would, being the people in power, other everyone else. So the neutrality is for Hapa people, and so pink is other. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't come with that baggage. It comes with sort of like they're fragile, like they're babies, like that kind of language, which would be, racist and terrible, which I would argue that any imperialist power is racist and terrible. So right. that made sense to me in a lot of different ways, from the way that they would think about it to all the way to it just being kind of funny to me, to take the wind out of white supremacy in at least my own book.
I mean, it is funny, but it also, in that, I think you can do a lot with humor that is almost like more insidious,
Yeah, I agree.
So another thing I wanted to talk about with this book is the presentation of violence. So, this book is very much, it's like a swashbuckling, it's in the tradition of like a swashbuckling pirate novel, right? Mm-hmm. But it's seems to be, to me, very consciously sort of separated from that genre in a number of ways. And the presentation of violence is one of those things. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you were thinking about that, like both in terms of how violence is generally dealt with in this genre, what it was that you were doing differently.
This is my favorite interview I've ever done already. But these are the things that I would stay awake thinking about even when I wasn't writing, while I was in the process of drafting this, because it was really important to me to think about violence in a particular way. So people love pirates, and I don't think they're wrong. They symbolize sort of like rebellion and adventure and like the limitless potential of the sea. And that's all cool. But then you're like, oh yeah. And then they raped and killed people and everyone's like, yeah, I'm in. And I'm like, I'm not. That's messed up. That's incredibly upsetting. So when I wanted to write my own pirates, I wanted to make sure that every act of violence that is committed in this book is given its moment of horror. The book that I read for the first time where I really started thinking about this was The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. And in it, every time there is violence, it is horrible and it sticks with the character throughout the entire trilogy. And so I told myself if I was going to write violence, that I would challenge myself to do the same thing, because I do think that that's the most responsible way to handle violence. Is not that it's exciting. It's not that, someone gets shot and then you just move on and everything's fine. Every time violence is committed in this book, I hope that people feel startled by it, because violence is terrible. And when we write fiction that elides that, I think that we do ourselves a real disservice. Yeah.
I mean, it is really striking because, and people talk about this all the time, right? But it's like how we glorify violence in so much of our media and so many of our stories. And yet most of us, I mean, at least I would like to think, if we were to find ourselves in this situation, would be really upset about it, right?
Yes. I think about that all the time. Like, I love The Hunger Games as much as anyone. I read the arc of it in one day, like in a complete fugue state, because I was just so into the plot. But, I don't know that it necessarily engages with the full horror of what's happening. And so when I wrote this book, I was like, well, it's not worse than The Hunger Games. And we started getting these reviews back of like, oh, this book's really violent and people might be upset by it. And on the one hand, I was like, well, it's less violent, but I'm glad to hear that people will be upset by it, because they should be.
Yeah.
I would not be chill about any of this. And I don't like characters who would be.
Yeah. So there's one more thing before we go into the break that I kind of wanted to talk about. This one might be a little bit more of a stretch, but we'll see how this hits you. Another thing that's very central to sort of the interpersonal conflict between the characters has to do with class. Mm-hmm. And I mean, right off the bat, I think that the way the class is presented in this book is really interesting and really well handled, but that's kind of not where I wanted to go with this, because there is this interaction that happens between one of the main characters, Flora, and Flora's brother, Alfie, about a third of the way through the book, right? Where Flora is becoming more and more sort of emotionally entangled with the other main character, Evelyn. and is having, regrets and second thoughts about the things that she knows is about to happen, and expresses this to her brother. And there's this moment where he says, I hope this isn't giving too much away. He says, there's no such thing as deserving. There's only what we get. And for the first time in that girl's life, she's getting the shit end of the deal. Mm-hmm. And this, to me, there's so much embedded in that, right? Because you've by that point in the book, you've done a lot to show just how awful Flora and Alfie's life has been, especially as children. And so you can very easily see why Alfie would sort of totally lack compassion in this moment, right? Yeah. But to me, this question of compassion is a really interesting one, and it is a very fraught one, especially for people like you and me who are like extremely online, especially on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And it's one that I've been thinking about a lot, especially the last, couple of months. This question of like compassion across like...
when you're asking people from an underprivileged group to have compassion for people who have had privilege their whole life.
Yeah. But it also strikes me that compassion is kind of like a central thing in this book, like in going in both directions, right? Yeah. So much of what happens in this book is tied up in this question of understanding each other and compassion and things like that. Yeah. And I wanted to talk to you about this, about how you think about this stuff.
Yeah, it's not a question I exactly have an answer to. I wrote it the most hopeful way that I could think of. Mm-hmm. I think that Alfie's point is incredibly fair, and that's something that I think about all the time. One of I would say, main source of privilege in my life is that I am incredibly financially stable. I have generational wealth, and then as though that weren't enough, I married somebody who skills are much more saleable than mine, and nearly guarantees a life of financial solvency as long as we're entwined. And so I think about this a lot, and like, what kind of kindness do I deserve? And I'm not sure that I deserve any, but I do wonder when push comes to shove, especially because I'm online and I see people talking a big talk. I don't believe, because violence is horrible and because death is terrifying, that people are as strident in their beliefs as they think about what people do and do not deserve. And so whether it's compassion as like kindness, or just like a genuine horror that ending somebody else's life is a terrible thing, just instinctually. Yeah. I don't have an exact answer to it. And it's not that I think that Alfie is wrong at all, which is why he doesn't have to reckon with that question really for the rest of the book. It's just something he poses to Florian, and they take from it what they do. Their situation is different and complicated because they fall in love with somebody. Alfie doesn't, and Alfie doesn't have to question that. And so I'm not trying to use that character to lecture people without privilege about being nice to people with privilege. I think that the annoyance and the resentment and the feeling of like, take care of yourself, like I don't need to take care of you anymore, is just. But I do think that when it comes to like, do you feel comfortable with them dying then? Maybe that's a more complicated question. I hope that's a more complicated question for people. And that was really all I was trying to present, is not a demand for clemency so much as a real pointed question of like, are you really cool with them all dying?
Well, and I mean, I do think it kind of ties in with this whole thing about violence, the way that, in the very first scene of the book, Florian murders somebody, right? And then that ends up haunting them throughout the rest of the book. Yeah. And I think that you're led to this point where you can see why everybody sort of is the way that they are. But there is, I think, a real question about like, if violence is really horrible in the way that the story understands it to be, then, where do the limits of these things fall? And what are our responsibilities end up actually being? I don't know. I don't think the book necessarily answers these questions, but the fact that it is asking them in the first place does feel, kind of important to me.
I'm glad. I mean, it's the kind of thing that keeps me up late at night.
Me too.
Genuinely, like it's something I'm really concerned with all the time. And I understand that I don't deserve necessarily any sort of empathy for that. But, you know, I would like to think that people who are like, you know, eat the rich, kill anyone with, you know, this kind of financial solvency, maybe would feel weird about that if they were sitting in a room with me and we could have a chat.
Yeah. The thing you were saying that people might be a little less strident than they realize, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I even feel myself doing that sometimes because, like, you, especially right now, where like the socioeconomic gaps in American society are so bare and so fucking terrible that it's hard not to be like, Bill Gates, pull your fucking shit together and just give everyone your money. Like, just solve this. And I do agree with that. And part of me feels, you know, I'm very much, at least philosophically, in line with people who are like, just take their wealth, take it away. It's, you know, you're not really earning it if you're not essential labor. Like, I think that's something that we've kind of proven out during this quarantine. And, but that's not the same thing as being like, well, just murder them.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't look at the French Revolution and think, dope, let's do that again. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, build the gallows. Like, that fills me with a real horror. And I feel like anyone with empathy will kind of feel that way too, even if you are like, yeah, well, this is what happens. And part of me feels that way. I just don't think a guillotine is really the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's kind of a weird note to end things on, but why don't we take a little break and come back and do the second segment?
Great.
All right.
Glad I could leave you with that.
Okay, so for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Yeah, so I know you have 3 kids. I just had my first son, and we're both big readers. He's very cute, by the way. Yeah, thank you. And something that I'm thinking about a lot, because I have been reading Dr. Seuss books to Noah, and my husband and I have been reading Harry Potter out loud to him. Not that he cares. He's 2 months old. Is how to think about authors who are deeply problematic and have said and done horrible things, and whose work sometimes has evidence of some really bad opinions about humanity and whose life has worth and whose doesn't. How to talk to kids about that stuff, because sometimes those are the people who have made some of the most important children's books of our time. I mean, Harry Potter being an obvious example. I still think the Lorax and Horton Hears a Who are 2 perfect children's books. And these aren't questions that I have answers to exactly. It's just something that I'm really struggling with. And I thought it would be fun to chat about that with you, because I know you're really thoughtful as well.
I try to be. And the problem with being thoughtful about these things is that you kind of end up going around in circles and never really coming to any conclusions. But let's see where we get.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is as a parent, like, as you say, I have 3 kids. The oldest is 11. The youngest is 5. And so, you know, reading with them is not just one of the high points of my evening, but it's also something that's really important to me, you know, sharing stories with my kids, and especially sharing stories that were important to me as a child is something that has always been really important to me. And also makes it exceptionally devastating when they reject those particular stories. You know, I mean, trying to sort of figure out how to curate or at least talk to my kids about what they're reading and that kind of thing has been a real challenge. And even just selecting books, like when I think about the books that were really important to me, the authors that were important to me as a child and as a young adolescent. Like, for example, I have to reckon with the fact that almost all of the authors that were really important to me as a young person were straight white men. And is that something that I want my kids' reading to be founded on? Probably not. But even among the ones that are not straight white men, like, for example, J.K. Rowling, there's right. Some questionable stuff in there. And how are we going to talk about that? It's complicated.
It's super complicated. So Let's start with Harry Potter because I feel like it's fresh on my mind, and it's, you said one of your kids is reading it right now, right? And one's a super fan.
Yeah, my middle child, my daughter, older daughter is, we're almost done with the third book now. Mm-hmm. And my oldest, my son, is like, he's really, really into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, on the one hand, awesome. Like, you're into a series of books, you're a super fan of books, like, that's best case scenario so far as I'm concerned as a parent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's cool. I'm 100% in support. On the other hand, the fat phobia in those books is so loud and so clear.
Yeah.
Like, from the get. And so one of the things Adam and I have been practicing, even though Noah doesn't understand what we're saying yet, is to try to make fun of it when it happens, because it's always the worst writing in the book also, coincidentally, because it's very lazy to just pick on fat people and be like, because they were fat. Get it? Fat. Mm-hmm. And so we try to laugh at it and be like, isn't that mean and stupid? But that's not really enough. and that doesn't even address the fact that in real life, she's outed herself as an incredible transphobe.
Yeah.
And you're like, great. So I'm actively giving you money. And you're already richer than the queen, and you are super mean to trans people.
Yeah.
I don't know quite how to deal with that other than to just be frank with a child when they're old enough and be like, yeah, I loved these books too, and this would be the house I'm in, but, it makes me sad that Joanne Rowling is like this, or that she made Dumbledore gay off the page. These sort of cowardly choices that belie homophobia are a real bummer.
Yeah. I mean, to me, there's sort of two things in that, right? Because there's what's actually in the work, whether it's explicit like the fat phobia, or whether it's things that you can sort of infer from what is or isn't in the book. Mm-hmm. And then there's the thing about the author and whether the author is or has done problematic things. And I'm not sure those are separate or separable questions, but they do feel like a little bit different to me, right?
Totally. I agree. Sorry, I also forgot house elves. But yeah, just period. And my solution for them has to just been correct the grammar as I read out loud so that, it's not as horribly offensive just from the get-go. But I do think that you're right, that what's on the page is more easily interrogated with kids, where you can be like, the book says this about Dudley, but that's really mean, and here's why. What do you think about that? Do you think it would be fair to pick on someone, whose parents are forcing them to try to lose weight and they're struggling with it?
Yeah.
These pose it as a question, I guess. Like, what do you think?
Yeah.
Even though Dudley's mean?
I'm not real good at being funny, so like making fun of books isn't something that I'm able to do real easily in the moment. But we do, like with my daughter, a lot of times, especially when it's around the Dursleys, we'll have a little pause and we'll say, well, what do you think about that? Or even with my youngest, and she's only 5. Like, we were reading the Junie B. Jones books recently, and mostly those books are cute, kind of harmless, but there are, occasionally there will be something in there, and I'll stop and say, well, what do you think about that? And it's interesting, like, I think kids are able to sort of process and consider moral questions at a much younger age than most people give them credit for. You know what I mean?
Oh, hard agree. Yes. And I love hearing that from a parent.
I don't think we really gain a lot by pretending that kids can't understand things and not giving them the opportunity to think these things through.
So, like, to that end, there's questions like the SFPL banned or had a conversation around banning the Indian in the cupboard because of historical inaccuracy and, a pretty chauvinist representation of Native Americans, right?
Right.
It's also like a wonderful story about a boy who learns to take care of something that is less powerful than himself, which is a beautiful and profound thing to think about, especially sort of the tenderness required for a young boy and how few narratives we have that sort of address that in that way. And I had really mixed feelings about it because on the one hand, I'm not Native American, and so my opinion doesn't matter at all. On the other hand, I guess there's no on the other hand from there. I do just sort of wonder if banning it is not a great decision because it precludes the opportunity for a really good discussion.
Yeah.
Of like, this book has a lot of things to offer and it also has problems.
Yeah. And that's entirely the question is we can agree that harmful stereotypes are harmful, right? And so putting those ideas into our kids' heads is not great. Reinforcing those stereotypes is almost certainly doing things that are bad. But, you know, also you kind of can't avoid the stereotypes, right?
Right.
So like, I don't know if like pretending that the stereotypes don't exist is necessarily going to do a whole lot other than maybe put you in a situation where people are like, oh, I don't see race. It's a fiction, right? So, you know, I mean, I don't know. I think it's really hard. The question too of like, what do you do with the problematic author is like, I mean, that's a whole other thing too. And like, to be honest, I haven't talked to any of my kids yet about the really like turfy stuff that J.K. Rowling has especially recently done. And it's like, those things are deeply upsetting to me. And I don't quite know how to talk to the kids about it. One of the things that I keep coming back to, and I'll be frank, like the especially with my son, the sort of thing that makes it hard for me is like these are books that he like loves with his whole self. And I don't want to take that away from him, you know? And one of the things that I know that like he cares about things like that so much that like it would ruin the books for him. But it is also a conversation I think is important to have. One of the things that I've mentioned this on the show before, there's a piece by Nicole Chung where she was writing about this book of essays by E.B. White that was all about sailboats. The essay isn't really completely about this, but there's a part towards the end where she sort of acknowledges that when E.B. White was talking about and writing about sailing and, you know, sailing as like a metaphor for being a writer, it's almost certain that he wasn't thinking of like a Korean American adopted girl, right? But that this is something that she just chooses to say, well, this is for me. And it doesn't matter whether or not he intended it to be for me. I'm choosing to take it.
Yeah.
And there is something about that I've always, ever since I read that, I think about it a lot. And this act of saying, you didn't make this for me, but I'm claiming it anyway, does feel like an exercise of power to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so what I'm hoping is like, you know, because there are things in Harry Potter, for example, that are like actually like really good things for kids to be thinking about, like, you know, the ability to be compassionate for people who are not necessarily exactly like you, like the ability to be, I mean, this isn't handled well in a lot of cases, but like, you know, the fact that it's even addressing class consciousness at all is another thing. You know, people, you know, kids having agency, being able to be brave, like, all of that stuff is really great for kids to be taking in. So like, I think
it's about kids overthrowing an totalitarian ethno-state in the end. Like I'm all about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like, when I think about this for myself, I'm thinking like, if I'm aware of the fact that this person, for example, if I'm aware of the fact that Roald Dahl was like really anti-Semitic, then I can like read his books and know that about him and choose not to take those parts from it. If I'm aware of the fact that J.K. Rowling is transphobic or appears to be transphobic, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know what the right language there is.
I think like, transphobic's fair.
Then I can take that and I can choose to set that aside and reject that part of it.
Right.
The question for me is like, if my kids aren't aware of that, then can they choose that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. And your point about it, like genuinely breaking your son's heart, it just breaks my heart to even think about.
Yeah.
I would not know how to handle that because kids should be allowed to love the things that they love, especially when they're books. I really feel that way where like, I feel like childhood like when parents wring their hands about their kids being good readers or not, all I really want for any kid is just to love reading, to find it however they want. So if that means rereading the same 3 Captain Underpants books forever and ever and ever, but you love it every time, then that counts. I don't care. That's fine. But it is such a complicated question because on the other hand, you're also sort of taking away precluding the opportunity for a certain amount of autonomy. Yeah. If they don't know that information and you're aware that that would matter to him. I'm not sure which is more important. I really don't have an answer. That is such a profound question.
It is the kind of thing that that I've been sort of wrestling with for 11 years now, and I've never quite figured it out. And the thing is that like eventually, I'm sure that he's a good kid and he thinks about stuff like this a lot. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that at some point, whether or not I tell him, he is going to come to this realization, right? Like he is going to find out these things about J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
And he's going to be upset by it. And he's going to have to figure out how or whether that changes his relationship to the books. And I guess the question for me is like, what is my responsibility to sort of hasten that reckoning? And I just don't know. Like, I think that when he's having that reckoning, that like it is my responsibility as his parent to give him resources for how to, help him think about these things and, support him emotionally and things like that. But like, whether or not it's my responsibility to make that happen sooner, I just don't know.
I don't either. I'm so interested to see how this ends up playing out. I mean, on the one hand, it's clear that you've done a beautiful job nurturing him so far because you know that this is something that'll matter to him. And to even have that be central to all of this is an indication of good parenting that's already been done.
Well, thank you.
Seriously, because a lot of kids... I don't know. I've met plenty of indifferent kids where I would tell them this and they'd be like, yeah, whatever, expecto patronum, I'm into it. And so like, well done. Were there choices you made with earlier books that you feel helped lead to this place?
Well, I'm not sure that it necessarily came from making decisions about books so much as just like, we stop and talk about things that, I mean, I even hesitate to put it in terms of right and wrong, but it's like trying to focus on like, how do the things that we do affect other people kind of thing? Mm. Of course, then I worry that like he's going to be like so paralyzed by like, in the way that I am often paralyzed by like every little thing that I do is wrong and harmful. And so like I can get really in my head about like, can I even do anything?
Yeah.
Which I suspect that is going to be a thing that he's going to have to deal with at some point. And so, I just try to fall back on the idea that there's nothing that I can do. I am definitely going to screw up my kids and I'll just maybe try to pay for their therapy bills later. I don't know. But it's not so much that I have necessarily wanted to like curate what he reads by taking things away, but that like if I'm providing a variety of stuff for him, that like it was really important for me. When I was a kid, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were like foundational books for me. Mm-hmm. And I think the first time I read The Hobbit, I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. And I've read those books at least 20 times over the course of my lifetime.
Wow.
I mean, something that tells you what kind of a nerd I am, I guess.
Deep.
So I always knew I was going to read The Hobbit to my son when he was, a fairly young child. But like, there's things about The Hobbit, for example, there are, as far as I know, like no female characters that get to talk ever in that book.
No speaking female characters. That's true.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that was something I was concerned about. And so like a big part of it was like, I made sure like I'm going to read books to him that feature girls and women in prominent, like, as protagonists. I'm going to read books to him and to my daughters that are written by women, all these different things, and try to like give them a lot of different viewpoints. And what ended up happening was, I think he was 6 maybe 7 when I read him no, he was 6 when I read him The Hobbit the first time. I don't know why I said the first time, because I've only read it to him once. But we got about halfway through the book and he stopped me and said, "Daddy, how come there's no girls in this book?" And it was like, that is one of the proudest parenting moments I've ever had.
Yeah, no kidding.
Like the two things that I always think of when I think of my proudest parenting moments are the time that he said that, and then the other time when one of my children went and like refilled the toilet paper without anybody asking.
Whoa. Whoa. Well done.
But I guess it's just been my hope that if I can expose my kids to many different viewpoints and then give them some critical thinking tools, that they'll come to realizations on their own. And in a lot of ways they have. So,
yeah,
but there's always more work to do on this stuff.
Of course. It makes me think of so one of the decisions my mom made that I thought was really interesting when I was a kid, because sexism was sort of her thing that she wanted us to be incredibly aware of, was we were never not allowed to watch this or read that or play with Barbies or whatever it was. I loved Barbies. But her rule was if it was horribly sexist or racist or whatever, she just wouldn't engage with it with us. So if I was watching F Troop, I think it was, some horrible Nick at Night show with super racist depictions of Native Americans, it wasn't you have to turn that off. It was just oh, you're watching that? I'm not watching that with you. Or I Love Lucy. She was Desi Arnaz was a wife beater. This show is incredibly sexist. So she just wouldn't watch it. And because she was working full time, I really valued my time with her. And it didn't mean that I turned it off every time, but it implanted a certain sense of oh, okay, we're critical about this seed for me that was incredibly effective. So even as I played with Barbies and I loved them, even as a child, I was able to hold the complicated reality of but this isn't realistic and it's kind of messed up that this is the toy that girls have. Also pass me that dress. And those things could happen at the same time.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I think that was a smart decision because I was raised that way and, it still works for me. But I do wonder if it's you're saying, it's not really giving the kid the opportunity to come to that conclusion on their own.
I mean, I think giving kids the opportunity to figure things out and let kids come to their own conclusions about things is maybe one of the harder things about parenting. Because, I mean, I would imagine this is the same for you, but I have really strong opinions about a lot of things, right?
Yes, we share this.
And, but you also don't want to beat your kids over the head with stuff, right?
Right.
You don't want them to agree with you just because it's what you think.
Right.
And I think for me, another thing that's been really important is asking kids questions and sometimes just being okay with their answers, I mean, I do get sort of Socratic method with them, asking them very leading questions, and that works to some degree and doesn't to some degree. But this is another thing about our culture is very sort of condescending to children, that we don't really give kids a lot of credit or credibility when it comes to their ability to think things through. And part of that has to do with if we're never actually listening to what they're saying, then that's just, teaching kids that they don't have to say things or think things through,
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. I'm sure it is really hard to listen to kids come to conclusions that you consider wrong, particularly your own kids. I'm sure that's deeply frustrating. And I think you've just named what I anticipate being one of my hardest battles as a parent. But your opinion is bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the way that I always come down to it for myself, and I will just say that both for you and anyone listening, I never ever give people parenting advice because I just think that's bullshit.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that made me the most anxious and upset when my own kids were babies is just all of the constant advice from everyone.
Yeah.
But the thing that I always come back to, and this is just sort of how I try to think about everything, is that my kids are not an extension of me, and they're not a problem to be solved. They're people.
Right. Wild, Mike. Wild philosophy you're espousing here.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily think a lot about, is that
I agree.
Children are are human beings with like complicated and complex emotions and inner lives. And, you know, like for me, I remember this thing. This was so probably 9 years ago now, 10 years ago. It was right before my son's second birthday. Comic-Con happens in San Diego, and Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank were in town, and I happened to know Ty from a long time ago. So these are the guys that wrote The Expanse. Mm-hmm. And I was talking with Daniel. My son was just about to turn 2, didn't have any other kids yet. And we were sort of like talking with him. We were having drinks, and he was talking about parenting. His daughter is, I want to say, like 6 or 7 years older than my son. And he was saying, you know, as parents, it's not so much that you're raising your kids so much as just kind of getting to know them. And I thought, like, that was a really hard idea for me to get behind for a really long time after that, but I think it might be completely correct.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful idea. One of the things I keep looking at Noah with is my family tends to have the thing where we're like, oh, you're just like your dad, you're just like your mom. And that's how we talk about kids, is like we kind of fiddle through all their traits and pick out the ones that already exist in the family and be like, oh yeah, she's got Joanna's sense of humor. Like, oh yeah, she's got Mika's eyes or whatever. And what I'm really blown away with Noah, and this might have something to do with being in quarantine and not having time to be around family as much, is he's so clearly his own person. Like, it's actually really hard to audit him for aspects of me and Adam. And when I think of the stories that I've heard from both of our infancies, it seems like he's completely different. And I find that so heartening and so profound, of like, oh, look, we meet a whole different person that has nothing to do in a lot of ways with who we are. He's just making his own way, being his own person. And I think that that's really lovely. Yeah. Well, so I think that's a lovely place to sort of wrap things up. There's one question that I like to end with, and that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you. Yeah, I just binge watched Never Have I Ever. Oh, okay. Yeah, it is an incredibly charming young adult TV show with an extremely flawed protagonist with whom I felt like an uncomfortable amount of kinship. And I'm so impressed by the writing in that show. I think it's really compassionately written. It's incredibly diversely cast. It's about this girl named Devi whose father has died the previous school year at her music concert. So like everyone saw it happen. It was horrible and sudden. He had a heart attack. And for like a while afterwards, she was just paralyzed from the waist down, and they didn't know why. It was like completely psychosomatic. And she randomly is able to start walking again. And it's really the story about her being like a horny, like horrible friend. And it's such a sweet coming of age story. And the fact that it's narrated by John McEnroe is just one of the many things to love about it. And I think right now I'm really gravitating towards incredibly wholesome media because, like, is the world not grim and terrible enough? And so I really appreciated how just gentle this story was, while still dealing with things like horrible grief and like capacious anger and these things that are very familiar to anyone around teenagers a lot. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thanks so much for taking the time and talking with me. I really appreciate it. I had a great time. Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on. Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to where you can purchase both The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, and Maggie's picture book, Also an Octopus, both of which come with my recommendation. You can also find a link to Maggie's comedy Animal Facts podcast, Drunk Safari, which I also highly recommend. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, the best things you can do are tell a friend, share the episode on Twitter and tag us at ChannelOpenPod, and leave a review on Podchaser. There's a handy link in the show notes where you can do that. You can find all of our social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. If excellent and inclusive audio fiction is something that sounds good to you, you can check out my other show, Likewise Fiction, where I read outstanding short stories by authors including Amal El Mohtar, Celeste Ng, Alvin Park, Sarah Hollowell, Ani Sisonkuni, and more.
You can find that wherever podcasts can be found or at likewisefiction.com. Keep the Channel Open will be back on June 3rd with a conversation with poet Leah Weezar, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.